Anyone who has played Resident Evil knows that the chronological order of events in the popular franchise is even more complicated than the Legend of Zelda series. While the vagueness of the Resident Evil timeline isn't just about its story, and even the names of the different versions of the series and the order of their release can be confusing for players. The complexity of the franchise's chronological order may be as difficult for different gamers to figure out as Resident Evil 6's story. To start with the complexity of the Resident Evil franchise's storyline, let's talk about some of the things about Resident Evil Code Veronica that was released for Dreamcast in February 2000. Many players consider Code Veronica to be an unorthodox version of Resident Evil, and it's not hard to understand why. Code Veronica was released for a console that stopped operating a year later, and a released year after Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Following this release, some of the best Resident Evil games were made available in the following years. Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 0 were first released in 2002, and Resident Evil 4 was released after the release of Code Veronica in 2005. So it can be seen that Code Veronica, in addition to having a strange and mysterious name compared to other versions of Resident Evil, is one of the least regarded games in this popular series due to the time coincidence with some of the best versions of the franchise. However, the Code Veronica is not limited to just these topics. In addition to being a very high-quality game, it could have easily been called Resident Evil 3, but the question is, why didn't that happen? Before we talk about Code Veronica's mysterious place in Resident Evil's history, we need to mention another game in the franchise that was on the verge of production. Capcom originally planned to release Resident Evil 2 for Sega Saturn. In fact, Capcom asked developer Nex Entertainment to work on the Resident Evil 2 port for Sega because the company was planning to release its games to more consoles. Although Capcom was able to port the original Resident Evil for Sega in a strange way, the company quickly realized that Resident Evil 2 couldn't be experienced on the console, so Capcom decided to launch a high-quality game for the next-generation console instead of offering a poor port for Sega and annoying the gamers community of the console. While Capcom's decision sounded reasonable on paper, at least on paper, the plan to build a new RE for Dreamcast caused particular problems around the Resident Evil franchise. Prepare yourself, as this video is going to explain some of the weirdest things about some of the best Resident Evil games. After the success of RE2, Capcom decided to give the green light to a number of Resident Evil franchise titles. These included Resident Evil Code Veronica, Resident Evil Survivor, Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil 1.9. The original storyline was supposed to be followed by Resident Evil 3. You can spend a lot of time talking about Code Veronica, but the key point is that this was Capcom's apology letter to Sega players for not releasing RE2 for the console. A number of key elements of Code Veronica were changed during the game's development to make the title work on Dreamcast, and we'll discuss these changes. Resident Evil Survivor is another rebased franchise. The game is a simple and uncomplicated shooter that was released without any structural changes in the initial time frame of Capcom. While the creation and publication of this title may have influenced the choice of name for RE Code Veronica, it does not have much to do with the topic discussed in this video. Resident Evil 0 is another interesting version of the RE franchise. The game was originally intended for the N64, however. Capcom soon realized that cartridges on the console were not capable of playing at all. It was at this point that Capcom decided to release RE0 for GameCube. Like the canceled version of RE2 for Sega Saturn, the decision to release Resident Evil 0 on GameCube reflected Capcom's strong desire to support more gamers. At this time, Capcom's initial decision to release RE to various consoles in a short period of time was beginning to fail, as the company noticed the low hardware capabilities of the predecessor consoles and the significant graphical leap of the next-gen consoles. Capcom has announced the launch of Resident Evil 1.9. It was the code name for the Resident Evil spin-off project under development by Kazuhiro Aoyama. Capcom's initial plan was for the Aoyama project to be released for PlayStation 1 in 1999. The game that Aoyama was working on was a relatively small game that was intended to be released in the same period of time as Capcom, and the players would finish it shortly. The decision to release these short, intricate games was to avoid any problems with Capcom's larger project. Resident Evil 3, which was being developed by Hideki Kamiya. In this version of Resident Evil 3, Hunk is expected to take on the lead role. This is while the story of the game was set on a ship, and the title was supposed to be Capcom's farewell letter to the PlayStation 1. The reason Kamiya's intended version of Resident Evil 3 was never released was Sony's unexpected decision to release its next-generation console, the PlayStation 2. After Capcom realized that the PlayStation 2 was coming and PlayStation 1 was gone, it decided to reinvent its Resident Evil 3 project after making profound structural changes to it and releasing it to Sony's next-generation console. The interesting thing is that Capcom's decision didn't go the way the company intended. The decision to release RE3 for the PlayStation 2 caused Capcom plans to crash the release of the game in the period of time. While Capcom could have allowed Resident Evil 1.9 and RE Survival to be the franchise's latest titles for PlayStation 1, some employees were concerned that the release of the two spin-offs for the PlayStation 1 might sour the relationship between the company and Sony, as the Dreamcast and N64 will see two bigger versions of the franchise at the same time. After a while, Capcom decided to release Resident Evil 1.9, which was in the final stages of development, known as Resident Evil 3, last escape release with name of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. The decision offended some Capcom employees. On the other hand, Kazuhiro Aoyama was in a position where his bizarre little spin-off was about to become a big Resident Evil game. Capcom director and producer Shinji Mikami described these decisions as examples of the team's efforts to interfere with game designers and reportedly threatened to resign the company. Aoyama and Mikami were both concerned that RE3, Nemesis, was a spin-off, small, ambition-free project that would not be able to handle the burden of becoming one of the franchise's originals. Although the game was called Resident Evil 3, Aoyama and Mikami were concerned about the player's reaction to a game that was set to be released after a short development process. On the other hand, another of the two men's concerns was the irreparable damage to the relationship between the PlayStation and Capcom players. All of these issues and tensions led Capcom to turn Code Veronica into Resident Evil 3 instead of turning Resident Evil 1.9 into a big game. If you were the president of Capcom at the time of the decision to postpone Resident Evil 3, and you had to choose between Resident Evil 1.9 and Code Veronica, then perhaps you could understand Capcom executives' preoccupation with those years. While Code Veronica continued the Resident Evil 2 story directly, the underlying problem was that the game was being developed for next-generation consoles due to their hardware power. On the other hand, the development process of the game was at a stage that, like Resident Evil 1.9, didn't need to make any major changes to be released on Capcom's intended time. All of these things made Code Veronica the best candidate. However, to better understand this, we need to explain some of the issues surrounding the state of Code Veronica and the Resident Evil franchise in those years. The first point is that the lead role in Code Veronica was Jill Valentine. In fact, Capcom's decision was to delve into Jill Valentine's adventures in Europe and her quest to explore the connection between the Nazis and the Umbrella Cooperation. However, this scenario was forgotten after a while. Capcom was concerned that paying the Nazis might seriously hurt the sales of games in Europe. On the other hand, with the end of Resident Evil 2 announcing the return of Claire Redfield, Capcom has abandoned its initial decision. This led to Resident Evil 1.9 bringing Jill Valentine to the game. Another important thing is that during that time period, Capcom was actually concerned about its relationship with PlayStation and its players. Capcom could have released Resident Evil 3 as an exclusive game for Dreamcast. But if they did, PlayStation 1 players who were waiting for the latest Resident Evil game for their console would have felt disappointed with the company's decision. Therefore, Capcom decided to prioritize PlayStation fans while also launching a new RE for Dreamcast. From an economic point of view, the decision seemed rational at the time. One of the rumors about the name Code Veronica is that PlayStation and Capcom agreed to release Resident Evil 3 only for Sony's console. However, Mikami and Capcom president Yoshiko Okamoto later stated that Capcom had decided to release the original Resident Evil versions for Sony at the time, exclusively produce and only provide side-by-side versions to other platforms. This was ultimately not practical, and in addition to Capcom releasing the RE4 to GameCube, the company originally planned to produce Resident Evil 0 for the N64. You might say that the contract for RE4 for GameCube was later signed, and Capcom didn't think of RE0 as one of the original versions. But the truth is that Code Veronica, far more than Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, instilled a true Resident Evil 3 feel. The question arises as to why Capcom allowed the Code Veronica team to tell a new story in the RE world in parallel with the original story, while viewing it as a side game from an economic perspective. While this is just a guess, it seems that the root of all of this is tied to Capcom's product release timeline and the company's effort to win the hearts of PlayStation fans. It's clear that Capcom originally planned to release Resident Evil 3 for the PlayStation 1, but the company also wanted to postpone the release date for Resident Evil 1.9 instead of changing the Code Veronica name. All of this while changing the name of Code Veronica probably made more sense in terms of linking to the franchise's different timelines, advancing the story, and the company's overall goals for the series. Capcom never intended to turn Resident Evil Code Veronica into Resident Evil 3. Of course, there is no evidence that Capcom decided to convert Code Veronica to RE3 after the company's initial plans for the original RE3 project collapsed. If you accept that Code Veronica for Become to Resident Evil 3 was released at the wrong time and for the wrong console, you might be wondering why Capcom didn't turn the game into Resident Evil 4. Maybe it's because Capcom was owed to PlayStation 1 players and needed to release the RE3 for the console, but why didn't Code Veronica be released as RE4? Don't forget that Capcom could easily port the RE4 after a while for the PlayStation 2 and other consoles. Of course, the company later released Code Veronica for the PlayStation 2. It seems that Capcom originally intended to release only the numbered versions of Resident Evil for the PlayStation. If that's true, then it doesn't seem like Capcom ever thought of turning Code Veronica into Resident Evil 3 or 4. The bigger problem, however, was the release date of Code Veronica. This argument probably won't go anywhere without mentioning the problems Capcom faced during the development of RE4. What you should know is that Capcom had no idea at first what kind of game Resident Evil 4 would be. It's even said that the original version of RE4 was later turned into Devil May Cry. Mikami said in an interview that he was so troubled by the hardware of the PlayStation 2 that he planned to release RE4 exclusively for the Xbox for a while, which was eventually released for Nintendo. What's interesting is that even if you believe Capcom originally intended to produce only the numbered versions of RE exclusively for PlayStation, their final decision to make the revolutionary RE4 game for GameCube led to the fact that Code Veronica was not properly released under the name of Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a very popular game with many fans. However, if you want to answer the question of what is the most logical RE to continue the story of RE2, the most appropriate answer would be Code Veronica. That's why, after the release of Nemesis, many players without knowing the story of the development of the game said it was more like a spin-off of RE2 and not a direct sequel to the game's story. PlayStation. One players who couldn't afford to buy the Dreamcast console looked at Code Veronica as a next-generation version of RE, while Capcom considered it its duty to release Resident Evil 3 to the PlayStation 1 in those circumstances. Of course, history shows that Capcom probably did the right thing in making this decision. Capcom knew that the name and credibility of the RE3 were of paramount importance. For this reason, the company decided to convert RE 1.9 to RE3, even though Code Veronica probably deserved to compose the name in every way. Capcom may not have been aware of Dreamcast's failure, but PlayStation's success was inevitable. On the other hand, Capcom may have been unaware of how big Code Veronica was, but the game probably wouldn't have been dubbed Resident Evil 3, even if it had been a great success, because it would have been a commercial disadvantage to Capcom. After years of that, it's safe to say that Capcom's decision not to release Code Veronica, with name of RE3, has led to the game deservedly not getting the attention of the gaming community. However, fans of the RE franchise have always referred to Code Veronica as the real RE3. Some say Capcom believed that Code Veronica was not qualified enough to get the name RE3, which history clearly points to the contrary. In the future, we may see Capcom pay attention to Code Veronica as it deserves. By then, many gamers can understand with Code Veronica why, in the minds of RE fans, this is the real Resident Evil 3.